Hi folks, welcome to the iWrite Radio podcast stroke videocast. I forgot my hat today, mostly because the sun was shining, because it's Hat Friday. We're going to go with the press conference to begin with, because it looks like there's going to be stricter lockdowns coming. Joanna Cherry wrote a piece in the National that's worth mentioning. Oh God, I've forgotten already.
It is now 6 years to the day since we nearly got our freedom.
We've got an anniversary to celebrate or commiserate with each other over. And I don't think we can ignore what's happening at Westminster in terms of Joanna Cherry's article. Mr. Keane's resignation, or Lord Keane's resignation, might be more accurate. And I'm quite sure there will be other things that pop up during the conversation.
I think it's impossible not to say something about the Salmond Scandal, I think it is now.
I think we have to mention it, unfortunately. But let's kick off with the presser. I think we can safely say that the theme of today's presser was there's more lockdown coming, folks.
The question of what and when and how tough.
Well, I would think that the most likely scenario is going to be don't meet other households.
That seems to be the story, isn't it?
That appears to be it. So a kind of individual lockdown. I would imagine one of the few places that won't be affected will be schools. They'll want to keep education running. What will be affected, I don't know. I don't know if pubs are about to shut.
Well, the curfews seem to be common across most England and Wales, and even in Ireland. They're making the pub shut at 10 or 11 at night.
Well, as an ex-publican, I have to tell you, all that means is people will go out 2 hours earlier.
And they'll go to a house party if they're still...
Oh, they'll go to somebody else's house afterwards, aye. I can't really see that making much of a difference, to be honest.
I suppose it's worth pointing out what the First Minister really... Right, her message, she was trying to get a message to Boris. She wants a COBRA meeting. She hasn't met or spoken to Boris for months, we discovered. When she has been speaking to MD in London, it's been Michael Gove. And we suspect he's been running the show ever since Boris got ill, to be honest.
I think it's indicative of the Westminster government's attitude to Scotland. I don't think they really care what happens up here. Not in the sense that they want the pandemic to run riot. I don't mean it that way. I mean, they don't really care what the Scottish government does. Therefore, they're not bothered speaking to them. It's a political, the Four Nations argument is a political thing for them, whereas it is important to the devolved nations because they're linked into the testing strategy of the UK. So they need good communications lines to overcome problems.
And the testing capacity is absolutely vital at the moment.
And I have to say, I got into an argument with somebody yesterday about this. I have quite a lot of sympathy. I mean, what's been achieved in 6 months with testing is really quite miraculous. And how anybody would expect it to run smoothly is beyond me. They've obviously never organized anything in their lives. I mean, it must have been like herding cats. Now, did Serco do as good a job as the NHS would have done? Well, we'll never know that because it's not going to be taken out of Serco's hands and handed to the NHS because it's too late in the day. But, you know, I mean, no great fan of Rees Mogg, but what he said in Parliament wasn't any less true for that. It's been a huge ramp up. And the number of strands that would have had to be pulled together to make it function properly, there was always going to be one or two of them would break.
Well, I'm going to remind the viewers and listeners that they cancelled what testing the capacity they had within about a week of the crisis breaking out, and
Well,
didn't do anything at all about it for a month after that.
well, nothing popped up on the radar. And I find it hard to believe that even this government at Westminster could be that incompetent.
Do you remember
that they weren't planning?
Do you remember looking at that back in the days when we looked at what the world? Well, we got to see what the World Health Organization was saying, and the guys was saying test, test, test.
Yeah, but the countries that were able to do that, for instance, Germany, had a huge lab infrastructure already.
That's true.
As part of their, normal running of the laboratory sector.
This is because they have a large biomedical manufacturing sector.
So they had that in place, and everything has a context. And I'm not saying that they did it as the Westminster government did this as well as it could be done. I mean, I'm particularly annoyed that they call it the NHS test and trace when it's Serco who's responsible for it. That ceases to make the difference between what happened in Scotland and England relevant, because Scotland went on the we've already got a test and trace program, let's expand it. And we don't know enough. I mean, I don't know how difficult it is to get a lab set up to do this testing. Did we have the people trained to do it, et cetera, et cetera?
Did you hear about them?
250,000 tests a day is an achievement, I think.
What was it? Apparently some people, they were, during the summer there, they'd hired postgraduate students and they were working at this lighthouse lab in Glasgow. But they'd gone back to do, they'd gone back to do
their real jobs, yeah.
To their real jobs.
I mean, that should have been foreseen. And like schools going back, the rise in required testing, that should have been foreseen. But it should have been foreseen by Scotland as well.
Nora, you and I have been through a reasonably big project planning exercise to get the radio station off the ground. And it's absolutely basic to foresee the most obvious problems you're going to have.
Well, no. I mean, project planning gives you a good framework. I mean, I think a better analogy would be somebody who has to project plan, say, a security system for computers. Now, that is a hugely complicated project. They just seem not to have been able. Well, are governments any good at looking down the line? Or do they just react day to day?
Well, that's firefighting. That's an old argument you and I don't want to have on.
No. Yeah, well,
the
other thing is the defense is much easier than actually sorting the problem. The defense is to spin. Well, it's difficult to say we got it wrong.
The one thing that the First Minister seemed to be stressing, and perhaps it was political, was that she wants the Prime Minister to lead a meeting of COBRA. And whether that's political on her part, it sounds as though it sounds reasonable, sounds like what you should be doing, given that we're looking at it getting out of control.
Well, in the context of the question that she was asked, which will you take a four nations approach to this? You're going to have to meet and talk about it.
Well, she's
or except you should be dictated to by England.
Well, she put herself front and central and said she has requested it.
And then which brings up the problem that Jean Freeman is facing at the moment. I watched her in front of the committee where she was accused yesterday of telling porkies.
Was she?
Douglas Ross asked the question of Mr. Jack. He asked him if he'd ever met her in the timescale, and she was asked the same question. And I remember her saying she'd had one meeting. Well, they've now accused her of lying to the committee.
What, this was yesterday?
Yeah.
And they've accused her of lying, something which is blatantly, obviously out there for everybody to see that she didn't.
Well, this is part of what I'm talking about, spin. She, as far as I remember, she said she'd had a meeting with him, but it hadn't been very useful, effectively. Douglas Ross then asked Jack in front of the committee if he'd had a meeting with her, and he said yes, and it was of an hour's duration or whatever. Well, if it was an official meeting, it'll be minuted somewhere, so they can put that into the public domain. But I can remember saying she thought she could remember one meeting. So that was the meeting. Now, this is the Health Secretary talking to the Governor-General of Scotland at the start of a pandemic, and they had one meeting. Now, why the Tories think that that's good enough, I don't know.
I've no idea. I didn't know. I saw that mentioned, a bit of a spat mentioned, but I thought it was just dross. Because it came from D. Ross, I thought it was dross.
Well, that was kind of, and that seems to be the game they're going to play. They're going to nitpick for grievance against the Scottish government, to use their own phrase.
They've got, you think about it, it just struck me thinking about yesterday, mentioning George, maybe it wasn't to you, George Monbiot standing in front of 55 Tufton Street. Yeah, I did mention it yesterday, that, you know, where are they getting their questions from? Where are they getting their scripts from, these Tories? They're getting the scripts from some people who are spending a lot of time thinking, well, what's a good question to ask? And today's question apparently was brought back up by McLaughlin of the Times. I'd forget his first name. And apparently this hack quoted Douglas Ross asking about a national tutoring service for the disadvantaged.
Well,
does that sound like a planted question thought up by somebody in Tufton Street?
Well, I mean, we have a national scheme. It's called the Scottish Education.
Yeah, and with the more extra teachers being hired to cope.
But I mean, the Tories in opposition at Holyrood are, I mean, they must have brass necks. They must have got a job lot, because every time they ask for something that's going to cost more money, they refuse to say where the money's coming from.
Well, it's more than brass necks. They have lied and lied and lied and lied. They lied to win the referendum on Europe. They lied to win that election last December, and they're constantly lying just now.
Well, I mean, my big worry about this internal market bill is that Scottish MPs get cut right out of the decision-making loop because of evil, because of English votes for English laws. I mean, it's quite possible that they pass laws that Scottish MPs are not allowed to vote on because of the rules of evil. And then this new group that they're going to create says, oh, in order to maintain the internal market, Scotland has to acquiesce to this.
That's what we're expecting.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's the idea that nobody has brought up the fact that Scottish MPs could be disenfranchised.
Well, it won't matter, because they're going to have powers. They're going to have a committee of unelected people with a cabinet minister at the top of it who will have all powers over, you know.
Well, ministers can make this decision.
Yes.
It's not even going to go before Parliament, let alone Holyrood.
Yeah, I think it's a Secretary of State, which is a cabinet minister, a senior minister, can make the decision to overrule anything that's happening in any of the devolved regions.
Well, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves on that one.
We are a bit. I don't know what else we've got to say about that, but expect the worst, guys. And I went for a walk for some reason or other, because it was a sunny day. I went for my walk along Portobello yesterday. It was very busy. I didn't feel at risk because I didn't do anything risky, but I can tell you there were hundreds of students down there, 20-year-old students down there, behaving like 20-year-old students.
You mean sitting studying while they drank their coffee?
Right. No, climbing over each other's backs in huddles. Whereas the rest of I'm sorry, I'm going to be suffering brickbats for this. The vast majority of people down there were behaving with social distancing, scattered all over the beach. And then there were these groups of 10, 20, 30 students, 20-year-olds, and all.
Well, hell mend them.
All in huddles. You thought there was a rugby ball in the middle.
I think we now have to move on to the least pleasant part of this. I think we have to talk about the Salmond inquiry at Holyrood. The Daily Mail had a front cover exposing WhatsApp messages from Mr. Murrell.
Was it on the Daily Record?
No, sorry, the Daily Record. The CEO of the SNP. I didn't quite read into it what the Daily Record read into it, but it appeared to show that he was all for Alex Salmond being put under pressure, and thought the police should be put under pressure to put Alex Salmond under pressure. Is that how you read it?
Well, I can read out what the piece, the message is, if you like.
Yep.
One of this is from Peter Murrell, husband of First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and Chief Executive of the Scottish National Party, to the Chief Operations Officer of the Scottish National Party, called Sue Ruddick, 25th of January 2019. Quote, "Totally agree, folks should be asking the police questions. Report now with the Procurator Fiscal on charges which leaves the police twiddling their thumbs. So a good time to be pressurising them. Would be good to know that the Met is also looking at events in London." And a second shorter message, "To be honest, the more fronts he is having to firefight on, the better for all complainers, so that the CPS action would be a good thing." So that he's talking about putting pressure on the police and talking about putting pressure on the Crown Prosecution Service.
I'd like to see the whole skew of messages. I'd like to see the context around this. Because if the context around it is, I support women in their fight against misogyny, it reads slightly differently. If the context is, let's get out Alex Salmond, he's in deep trouble.
It's the drip feed of evidence that's being leaked. And I think you can expect more, because this is just today's leak, and there was some 2 days ago, is all going in the one direction, getting no rebuttables.
Well, my problem is it's a drip feed out of context. Now, I'm going to do exactly what I did with the Alex Salmond case until I see it laid out in full. I'm not about to attack anybody. I do think, because of what I read in Wings, and I still trust Wings to have the information that he's not prepared to publish, that he thinks is strong enough that there is a case to answer both for Sturgeon and Murrell. And I trust him to have that evidence, but I'm leery of committing myself to attack anybody without seeing it.
I mean, you know, my first question, ever since the possibility of this being a bit of a conspiracy came out, was, how did they allow it to get to this? Didn't they stop to think?
It's because they've become what every political party becomes. They've become game players. They're not looking at the big picture countrywide politically. They've started looking at their own little bubble and how to cement themselves in place, how to deal with perceived enemies within the party. The Labour way, the Tory way.
This is what we've discussed,
Even the Liberal Democrat way.
But we definitely imported far too many people from the Labour Party into the SNP.
Well, I'm not sure that's... I think it might be more accurate to say that the kind of people who would have ended up in the Labour Party are now in the SNP. It's about political ambition, not about doing the best for the country.
Let me remind the viewers and listeners that my dissertation at university was about careerists in politics. I didn't come to a conclusion. I didn't have to. I just had to be able to do it and get a good mark for it to get an honours degree. But there you go. So it has concerned me for a long time.
We've been talking about this for years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when Alex Grant was still with us, this was a problem Alex spotted early on.
Mm-hmm.
And he was close to the SNP and close enough to walk into Murrell's office. And he spotted it. And it was always going to be a problem. And
I have the recordings of Alex Grant saying this, although don't ask me to go and dig through them unless I have to. Unless you're prepared to pay me lots of money, I've got hours of it. But I have got it.
But it's a serious problem. And I'm not sure it's a problem that can be solved because people do not join the party with that mindset. That mindset evolves within the political bubble.
All power corrupts.
Well, yes. I hope the upshot of this is that the SNP does what other parties have not done and they come clean. Because if they don't, they're just going to end up like Labour. They're creating two sides.
And of course,
fight each other.
The bigger issue is the independence of the country, of the nation.
Yeah, but I mean, this is, give it another name in another party. It's Brexit in the Tory party. It's anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And Salmondism is not what you want to create in the SNP. And I hope they've got time to cure this. I have my doubts.
Well, before there is whatever phases this, whether it's an election, a referendum, or something negative, I can recommend Iain Lawson, who's a very old. I say very old. I made this mistake before. He's been involved in the SNP long before there was any sniff of power, and he has said himself in today's piece. He publishes everything on his own blog so that he doesn't depend on a publisher. And he said he's held back from saying anything until now. He was saying very much. But I think that the piece that concerns me is we've got trials of Craig Murray and Mark Hirst coming up. It's not just Alex Salmond, and their trials are concerned in the same scandal. Now, what Iain Lawson says, in my mind, there's a very serious plot involving senior members of the SNP, senior politicians and civil servants in the Scottish government. And that's bad enough. But through their powers, they've influenced our justice system at police and court level and been engaged in very dangerous activities, as probably not intended. But they've involved these outside agencies. This is what's doing the significant damage to the independence cause. They've involved the courts and the police and the legal system of the country.
If it pans out that way, I mean, I have to point out that not every conspiracy is a conspiracy. what you simply get is like-minded folk in different positions who agree with your position, using their influence to further their own agenda. You know, so you could well have a case that everybody in the civil service hates Alex Salmond, therefore they're happy to further the political ambitions of other people who think Alex Salmond stood in their way in the past or will stand in their way in the future. So, you know, I'm not sure how linked up it would actually be. It just takes people who hate the same person.
I think that I like this line from Iain Lawson. Frankly, I hope, rather than this slow burn, he's talking about what's going on about this conspiracy. This accelerates and we get to the full truth sooner rather than later, no matter who is revealed to have been involved and no matter the consequences. And I have to agree with him because we really need to get this behind us one way or another.
But I think there's another way out of this. I think if Alex Salmond chooses to be the head of a second independence party on the list, that could help solve the problem. It takes him away from the SNP, ceases to be a threat to them. So they can kind of ignore him. Although, you know, they can make all the accusations.
Well, what should we suggest? We would suggest that they'd have the media outlets of RT, that's Russia Today, because Salmond's got a show there. They'd have the readership of Wings, and they'd have...
Oh, I don't think you can go as far as to say the readership of Wings.
And all right, but the outlet, it's a fairly large readership, and the credibility of Kenny MacAskill. It's interesting that the three of them, when you think about it, let's go back to the first time we ran into Stu Campbell on the Royal Mile. And the surprising thing was he was a bit of a pop star, wasn't he? He was handing out badges, his own badges, as if he was
he was promoting his website.
Yeah, but he was also a celebrity.
Yeah, he was, yeah.
Now, you've got to remember that Kenny MacAskill is a bit of a hero from the Dyed-in-the-Wool Independistas for being arrested on Wembley Way on his way to a Scotland-England football match. And, of course, Alex Salmond is a bit of a hero. So you've got three celebrity heroes.
I'm not sure I would go so far as to say...
Well, I was thinking you're the one that suggested that Alex Salmond should lead a list party. So put the three of them together, and
No. What I'm saying is that there are only two solutions: complete transparency, which is an unusual solution for any political party to take, or Salmond is out of the game within the SNP. So he leads a second independence party. So effectively, what you have is you have a new and an old Labour wing.
Yeah.
Totally separated.
Here's the question.
That solves the problem.
Well, here's the question that everybody will be asking, of course. But times have changed. Will the smell, the sexual innuendo, and the admission by Salmond that he has been a bit tactile, will that be too much for the voting public, or the voting public?
No. There will be a large cohort who will support Salmond. But what I would suggest is that if Salmond was to be involved in another party, create another party, it would only stand on the list. I can't see any way they would stand against the SNP and the constituency vote.
No.
So it kind of bridges the gap. It gives you a more robust independence-only party. And it gives you, I think it would give you huge leverage as far as the SNP are concerned.
Yes, obviously would, because you can't ignore a mandate.
And I'm not entirely sure Kenny MacAskill would be part of it.
No, the notion just jumped into my head now. So there. Yeah. And bear in mind, what people seem to forget is Kenny MacAskill as he said himself, 20 years as a defence lawyer, and he was Justice Secretary. He knows where the bodies are buried at the Crown prosecution and the top of the police.
Yeah, you get the impression that, well, I mean, Wings has certainly given the impression, Stu Campbell, that he has information that he can't put in the public domain. And if that's the case, Stu Campbell, in my experience, does not make up stories. So I think there is a lingering problem here. What I'm concentrating on is not the problem, but the solution to the problem.
No, I'm still concerned, obviously, that, and it's a selfish point of view, I'm concerned at what the impact on the independence cause. Sorry, that's Alexa talking back.
All right.
Alexa, stop. Where was I had a train of thought there. What was I saying?
You're concerned about the effect on the independence movement.
Oh, yes, but there's also another issue. There's Craig Murray and Mark Hirst, who seem to have become casualties.
That's weird, because that is a prosecution basically by the judge. Technically, it's the law courts, not the police, and not the faculty of advocates. That this is about, and it's so skewed. I mean, to accuse them of breaking the rules and not to go after the mainstream journalists.
Especially Craig Murray, when all that Craig Murray published was what he referred to articles by other people that other people had published.
It's that, and that's got a stink all of its own. That really has, because that looks like going after somebody because they supported Salmond. It looks like intimidation.
Yeah, well, I hope Craig doesn't go for a walk in the woods anytime soon.
Well, okay, let's move on. That was depressing.
Unfortunately.
Joanna Cherry's piece in the National. You wanted to bring that up, Stuart.
Yes. She's added some she's highlighted some other issues to do with the internal market bill, and also the attack on the Court of Session, Scots law. Now, what she says here, in my speech on the internal market bill this week, I saw that, I watched that. I emphasised that the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty is a creature of English law. We need to keep reminding our viewers and listeners, and that treaties are governed by international law, not domestic law. Now, as well as breaching the withdrawal agreement, Clause 45 seeks to oust the supervisory jurisdiction of the Court of Session, which is a Scots court.
Law.
In Scots law, in respect of regulations made under clauses 42 and 43. The Internal Market Bill also breaches Article 19 of the Treaty of Union. This excited quite a bit of interest, and I suppose that's what might excite me, and I'm not going to quote any more. I've touched on this already last week. It's another legal academic who's at the LSE in London, I think, and I said we'd come back to that. It has not been yet legally resolved about whether the Treaty of Union, even now, 300 years down the line, still protects the complete independence of Scots law from Westminster Parliament. That's the point I need to make. Well,
the three areas that were always presumed to be protected were the law, education, and the Kirk.
Right.
If that is deemed not to be the case, the treaty isn't worth the paper it's written on.
The problem is the Kirk has already been, the defences around the Kirk have already been changed, because one of the parts of the Kirk, let me explain it. only Presbyterians, not about the Queen, but I think it was only Presbyterians were allowed to hold official posts of some sort.
Yeah, yeah.
And at
Like,
some point in the history, in the last 300 years, that was changed.
that was basically an anti-Catholic move, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. But that was watered down. So that's one of the pillars already damaged. Education, I honestly don't know. So we're left with the Scots law. The question that really does matter is Scots law sacrosanct? Does it? The argument is that they cannot, through a bill, an act of Parliament in Westminster, stymie Scots law. But it hasn't been decided in a court yet. So, but where would the court be?
Well, there's been decisions where essentially they've said, no, you can't. But I don't think it's been pushed to the nth degree. I mean, while you are not at loggerheads with Scotland, the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster Parliament, I mean, in the past, you would have to get agreement from the lawyers in Scotland. Now you have to get agreement from the politicians in Scotland to change Scots law to be in line with English law.
If you, well, there's another question.
So, I mean, for instance, when we joined the EU, it was Scotland itself that had to align our laws to EU law. It wasn't done by English lawyers who simply said, right, that's what it is, live with it. You know, they had the independence. I would think there'll be outrage.
Well, let me throw into a mix.
Attempt to override Scots law.
Let me throw into something that just I think happened this week, because you wanted to mention Lord Keane. Now, the argument, I made the case yesterday or the day before, that one of the reasons that Keane finally stepped down, because he didn't appear to want to resign from his minister's role, what was he called? Not Lord Advocate General. See these titles, never mind.
Advocate General Chief High Hegen.
Anyway, a minister in Boris's government. He didn't want to step down, but he did. And I suggested that I had seen that apparently there was a lot of pressure being put on all barristers in England by the Bar Council that they should not break international law, and would therefore the Scottish advocates, because they don't have barristers in Scotland, would they take a similar position as English?
Well, it's part of your oath, is it not, that you uphold the law? So how any lawyer, be he Scots or English, can basically sign up to a bill that says we're going to break international law? I don't understand. And I think Keane, as I said yesterday, whether it was in order to protect his lucrative income from the Scottish law courts, or that he really did have a genuine problem with the idea of breaking the law, I don't know. But if he's gone, how can any of the rest of them stay? I mean, do they resign from the law?
Who?
Well, there's two English lawyers.
Suella
Braverman.
And Buckland, is it? Or
yeah. Well, he's Welsh, right enough. But I mean,
Welsh law is exactly the same as English law.
They're staying in position. So who knows? Maybe they'll get thrown out by English lawyers.
Interesting.
We wait and see. But of course, Boris's argument is we'll never have to implement it. I'm not sure how that stands. If you're prepared to acquiesce to the breaking of a law, is that a criminal offence? To the Bar Council, I don't know. Well, an offence that you can be chucked out for. Who knows? But it brings us back. I mean, finally, people are talking about the Treaty of Union. It brings us back to another possible route to independence.
Very much so. That is the fact that I think that's an extra mile that Joe Cherry's gone publicly with, that I don't think she'd been there before publicly, and you know, she's inching closer to. I mean, it's beginning to sound like Peter A. Bell is sitting there like this. In fact, he published an article he wrote in 2013 today as a riposte to Shona Craven's celebratory, shall we say, piece in the National, to say, oh, it's 6 years since the referendum, and she was kind of saying, oh, we just couldn't foretell. She was a no, I think she basically said at the time, although she changed her mind. But we couldn't see what all, in fact, if you'd written that, if you write everything down that's happened since the Scottish independence referendum, you wouldn't, and you presented as a script for a movie, they would throw it in the bin.
Well, I'm sorry. Everything that's happened was forewarned.
It was forewarned by Peter A. Bell, because he published what he
Boris
wrote
Johnson,
in 2013 today.
Boris Johnson. No, there's one speech. What's his name? The playwright. The Yes supporting playwright. Oh God, I've forgotten his name.
Alan Bisset.
Alan Bisset. He, in one speech, outlined everything that's come to pass.
I haven't seen that one. Okay, I'll look that up.
I'll have it somewhere. I'll send it to you. But he basically said they will strip power from Holyrood, internal markets bill. They'll refuse another referendum. Boris Johnson will get in power, and we won't be able to do anything about leaving the EU. So and if you think about where we were in 2014 and where we are now, and you don't consider that enough of a change to have another bite of the cherry, the only thing that will convince you to have another bite of the cherry is World War III.
Well, it's going to be violence, and we don't want to go there. So I don't know. It's looking like I've got a list of names for what I write about, what we call the blurb about today's show. We've referenced quite a lot of people today so far.
We have. Anything you want to finish with?
Well, there's a headline, but this would be going back. It says, Kenny MacAskill urges the Crown Office to probe the SNP Chief Executive. But we've covered that. Let me see. I probably not go into it. There's the Peter A. Bell and the Shona Craven. It's Shona Craven's article in the National and Peter A. Bell's riposte. He's good at being at riposte. I'd like to say that because I hadn't read it in any depth, but we briefly touched on Neil Asherson's article about Scotland and the current situation.
This was in the FT.
The
Financial Times.
No, it was in the London Review of Books, much more heavyweight than the Financial Times. The London Review of Books. So I took the time to read it in some detail, and I can heartily recommend it. Neil Asherson is 87 years old, born in 1932, and he was a genius. He went to Eton, and then he went to Cambridge University, and he was a member of the Apostles at Cambridge. They're nothing like that bunch of brigands at Oxford, the dining people. The
Bullingdon Club. Nothing
like that at all. No, the Apostles were a serious bunch. In fact, for a long time, John Maynard Keynes was the leader of the Apostles, but he died in 1946, so he obviously wasn't there when Neil Asherson was a member of the Apostles. But it's a very elite group anyway, and he's written for the Scotsman, the Guardian, and I can recommend the article. I'd like to return to it, not today, because it's a heavyweight article. But
give us a quick outline of its content.
Does the rest of who in the rest of Britain needs this union with Scotland, and why?
I missed that. You'll need to send me the link.
And I have a lot of it highlighted, so I don't want to start. We'll cover it, and I might even. I'll have to reread it anyway, because when it's something serious. When I was a younger man, I could speed read, and that was all I had to do. Nowadays, I have to write things down and read them again.
Well, the article this week, I think that's most influenced me is the FT article by Philip
Stevens,
was it?
or Stephen Phillips? What might be the other way around?
Yes, it might be. But I think that will do us for the day.
Yep.
As Philip, you may have, Philip
Stevens.
As you may well have noticed, folks, Jimmy Hutton isn't with us today. He's out with his nose to the grindstone. Thanks for being here, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me here.
And I'm Norrie Stuart. And thanks for listening and watching, folks. We'll have a day off tomorrow and catch up with you on Sunday after the various political programs.
Yes, and don't go to any house parties this weekend.
No, you've got to stay in. Didn't go to the pub.
You can go to the park.
Wear carry it.
That's all right.
But avoid all these students that Stuart saw down at the beach.
God, do they be?
Okay. Thanks for listening, folks. Cheers for now.